Hi students, I thought I would take a few minutes just to go over the study guide for our midterm exam, and I also will just give some tips about how I might approach studying if some of you are still looking for that type of guidance. We have, for the format of the exam, 12 short answer questions, and they're going to be worth 2.5 points each. I am generous with the partial credit, so it's always in your interest to answer every question and make a good guess. If you feel like you are blanking out on something, you may remember more than you think you do, and so if you put something down, I may be able to give some partial points for you. So we've got 12 questions, 2.5 points each, and worth a total of 30% of your exam grade. We're going to have a mixture of types of questions of multiple choice, true, false, and definition or brief fill-in questions. No more than a sentence will be required to answer any of these questions, and sometimes it will just be a phrase for the write-in type. I've given you just a couple examples here, and a brief definition question. Please briefly explain what a logical fallacy is in philosophy. A true or false question. Emotionalism is the idea that one's feelings about an action determine whether it is right or wrong. Okay, and we may have some multiple choice questions as well. You will also have one short essay question, which I'm looking for 3 brief paragraphs. And this is going to be something that I'm essentially giving you the topic in advance here on the study guide. You're going to write that brief short essay on the moral and ethical implications of one of the biblical stories in the Christian tradition that we've read and discussed online in class. And you can see that in the listing of the study guide below. If you'll scroll down, you can refresh your memory as to what biblical stories that we've studied. The questions that are in the specific prompt will come primarily from our discussion question handouts, the things that we've been using to guide our discussion in the forums. And these are big, broad ideas about the biblical stories. And so you can choose one in advance that you feel comfortable with and be prepared to talk about issues of ethics and morality in broad terms in that short essay question. And then we will have one long essay question worth 50% of the exam grade, so a good chunk there. About 5 to 6 paragraphs is what I'm looking for here. You are going to have 4 options to choose from, and you're going to choose one out of those 4. Obviously, the topics for the first reflection essay are not going to be repeated, but you can get a sense for the types of questions that I would ask, although, of course, these are going to be much shorter responses. The essay topics might ask you to focus on one reading in depth, or they might ask you to compare and contrast a few different perspectives. And each of our 3 units so far in the semester will be represented among those choices. Remember to have, even if it's very brief, it's always good to have a good essay format. So do a brief introduction, then do some body paragraphs that respond to the prompt that you've chosen, and then do just a very brief conclusion is fine. But that structure will help you organize your thoughts. I do recommend that for both the short essay and the long essay, that you compose as you're taking the exam. So I don't want you to do this in advance, but as you're taking the exam, compose in Word or your word processing program, and then save that, and then copy and paste the text into the space for the essay on Blackboard where the exam is open. That will just prevent any potential heartache if your internet fails or if Blackboard has a glitch, so I don't want you to lose your work as you progress. All right, general study tips. We want to review your handouts, the discussion questions, and notes that you've taken. Take a look at the forums and the types of comments that your classmates have made. Note the important terms that we've discussed. Terms, this is a great place for me to think about asking some short answer questions, and so terms and definitions could be a key component here. And a lot of the terms that we've been looking at represent different schools of thought in a philosophical or religious approach to ethics and morality. So refresh your memory and take a look back at those. And that brings me to the review here of the sections, the actual material that we've covered so far. The big, broad debate that we started the semester with was this discussion of action-based versus character or virtue-based moral philosophy. And so I'd like you to be able to speak to that. What's the difference between the action-based approach and the character-based approach? We want to walk through some of the basics that we looked at in the Rosenstand book about the use of narrative for ethics, and the different types of basics about ethics and morality that she covered, both from a scientific and a social scientific, psychological perspective. There were many perspectives that were raised there. We also started to have some narrative examples throughout what we've read so far this semester. We had the lottery, we had Big Fish. We've had some selections from primary sources, Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Poetics, etc., etc. You would want to be thinking about the way in which story engages us as human beings and the different forms of stories and how stories can teach moral and ethical lessons and sustain those types of norms. And we had, of course, that debate between Plato and Aristotle over the nature of drama and stories and art for promoting moral development. Remember, we had Plato, who was generally in favor of some censorship because he felt stories could be dangerous and could provoke people to act out the negative emotions or actions they saw portrayed at the theater. And Aristotle was the forerunner of someone who really supported catharsis and the idea. Remember, catharsis is that Aristotle thought we could actually purge our negative emotions, and that there was some benefit, there's some growth that happens when we see a tragic, even a very sad or violent tragic story play out in drama or in art, that it actually could kind of serve as a way of acting out those human emotions without having to do it in real life. So thinking back to that notion of catharsis. We then introduced our first approach to the Christian story or the Christian narrative. We looked at the Nicene Creed. We looked at those excerpts from the Catechism about the morality of human acts. And we looked at the creation story, Genesis 1 through 3. And I want to, again, as I emphasized in our discussion, take a fresh perspective on that story as much as possible. I know most of us know that narrative pretty well, but I want you to think about the nature of creation itself and the creation of human beings, how those descriptions might carry a moral or ethical weight in the Christian tradition. Remember, the Nicene Creed also is like a super condensed version of the entire Christian story embedded in this recitation of beliefs, but it really kind of encapsulates the Christian story. And as I said to some of you who are asking me about this with regard to the papers, there is a sense in which it conveys the empathy of God in Christianity, the idea at the heart of Christianity of the incarnation of God, that God has walked the earth at a particular time and place in human shoes in the incarnation of Jesus, and that makes a difference for Christian believers in how they think about their relationship to God and God's understanding of humanity and God's own creation. In the second unit, we move to this discussion of the nature and basis of morality. And remember, we had really this key debate between relativism and universalism. And in universalism, we had those two types. We had hard universalism and soft universalism. And so I want you to be thinking about the key arguments for all of those and benefits and drawbacks to each approach. I think in many ways, cultural relativism as a normative theory, remember normative is actually, I'm misspeaking here, so I'm going to retrace my steps. Okay, so it's cultural relativism is a descriptive theory. Okay, so descriptive theory means it's something that describes simply the way things are. It tries to describe the model of how we function in the world. And so cultural relativism is simply the idea that we naturally have cultural differences around the world, and that really has profound impact upon our sense of morality and particularly the details of our moral and ethical codes. Now remember that versus cultural relativism, we have ethical relativism. We had, again, ethical relativism championed by Ruth Benedict, which really is kind of a normative theory. So remember, a normative establishes a norm or a precedent and says how we should act or how we should engage a moral perspective. And so the idea with ethical relativism is not only do we have differences among cultures, but that we should respect those differences and not interfere in the morality of a culture different from our own. And remember, there are many benefits and drawbacks to this approach. One of the key limitations is the notion that we therefore can't necessarily claim certain universal human rights that would allow us to try to intervene on the behalf of people who we felt were being harmed in another culture or society. And remember the piece we read about female genital mutilation, Possessing the Secret of Joy, touched on that issue. Is it acceptable to say that another culture's practice that may, in our view, be harmful? Do we take a hands-off approach, or are there certain things that are just morally wrong in a universal sense? And remember, James Rachel's proclaimed the middle ground position of soft universalism versus the hardline approach of hard universalism, which is rather inflexible. Remember, Rachel says that there are certain moral basics that different cultures can agree upon, and therefore the details may look different, but the principles can be shared. Whereas a hard universalist argues that there is simply just one set of right or true moral guidelines and that everyone should be compelled to follow them. We got in depth a little bit here with our excerpt from Euthyphro by Plato. We looked at Halley's piece, From Cruelty to Goodness, such a moving piece about the town of Le Chambon and the hospitality that its citizens showed to people who were fleeing the Holocaust. Remember the definitions of decency versus nobility. Remember, decency is just to avoid doing what is wrong, right? He calls this the negative ethic, whereas nobility is to take positive action and to go above and beyond to do what is right. And the opposite of cruelty, and particularly remember Halley's conversation about institutionalized cruelty. For example, the institution of slavery is another example in addition to the Nazi regime and the Holocaust. The antidote to that, Halley describes as hospitality, this kind of welcoming goodness that respects the dignity of the individual, which is obliterated in those forms of institutionalized cruelty. So a lot you could say on that piece. We looked at Styron's depiction fictional depiction of a mother forced to make a choice between her children during the Holocaust. We looked at Rice's excerpt from Interview with a Vampire, the narrative just asking us to question at the opposite end, are there degrees of evil? And then what do we do with that? And how does that relate to degrees of good as well? We then look to this really kind of dramatic story, the testing of Abraham. Once again, we're all familiar, or many of us are familiar with that story. I want you to look at that with a fresh perspective once again, and notice the escalation of the moral choice that Abraham is making there. And is there a way in which religion is asking Abraham, and faith is asking Abraham to go beyond morality and ethics, to actually sidestep or ignore them in favor of following God's command. And we have Kierkegaard's excerpt from Fear and Trembling to really give us a meditation of that. All right, and then in our last section prior to the exam, we have this introduction to action-based or ethics of conduct. And we read the book of Exodus excerpt there that talks about the biblical law, and you noticed the model of justice that was emphasized in the book of Exodus. And we want to keep in mind, for historical context, for contemporary readers, the an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth justice really sounds harsh to us, but actually in the time of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, that was considered to be fair. The idea that the punishment should fit the crime, or that restitution should be proportional to the crime, that was considered to be a new model of justice, rather than something like the Code of Hammurabi, where the punishment could far exceed the gravity of the crime. We also read different ideas about egoism and altruism in this section, so be able to speak about the different types of egoism and altruism. We read about social contract theory and asking the questions, and we saw the excerpt from Hobbes that relates to this, asking the question is, why do people agree to come together to form societies with moral codes? Is it for self-protection, as Hobbes argued? Okay, and then we looked at another Christian story by looking at the excerpt from Luke, in which Jesus speaks about loving your neighbor and tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the Good Samaritan parable is in dramatic contrast to that classic piece of journalism by Gansberg about the true murder of Kitty Genovese. 38 who saw murder didn't call the police. And so asking the question of, when do we have a duty to act, and when is it moral to refrain from acting? That's kind of an earlier theme as well. This, again, the negative ethic, avoiding doing something bad, versus the positive ethic, going in above and beyond to offer help, or to do something good, or to be a good Samaritan. All right, so I would try to sum up each of the perspectives in a couple of one or two sentences. I will always on the exam supply the author and the names of the reading selection for the arguments I'm asking you about in a particular question. Try to know a few of the authors or arguments in each unit in greater detail. And you might prioritize based on what interests you most when you're thinking about possible choices for the long essay question. But remember, the short essay is something that you can really prep in your mind ahead of time. I don't want you to write anything out. Remember, it's on your honor that you will be composing as the exam unfolds in Blackboard as you sit down to take it. But you can give it quite a bit of thought, and you can kind of select ahead the narrative that you would like to talk about. And remember, I'm going to be offering some more specific prompts in that. Okay, good luck. I hope that this has been just a helpful overview for you. But really, if you've been following along, doing the work, paying attention, you should have no problem in taking the midterm. And feel free to contact me if you have questions. Thanks.